pair of bills, I think it's interesting because it shows how quickly legislation that's hot one year can suddenly just disappear. And I think that's a fair statement of this next bill.
The Equal Pay Act was very hot and is still something that's happening around the country. Legislatures are dealing with it and being asked to deal with it, and there's some pressure on the United States Congress to work on this, but that women and minorities do not have really adequate rights to appeal for, I need to be paid as much as he, or I need to be paid as much as that white person, or that whatever. I'm doing the same job. That we've not gotten any further than we were in the 1960s is a shame. In the 2018 session, the Senate passed a very good, sponsored by Gail Golden, and the House really carved it up badly. And I think that there was no will to look at that again this year. The Senate passed again Gail Golden's bill, but the House was not going to take up something that was that extreme, that bad for business. So women and minorities will have to wait a while for Rhode Island to get with the program in that regard. And sexual harassment legislation sort of stalled as well. There was a committee on conduct appointed in the House that was perhaps going to look at that sort of thing. I don't think the committee on conduct ever met. One of our colleagues in the House, at least I know of, made a complaint of sexual harassment. She was referred to the lawyer that the board has hired to deal with this sort of thing, and I guess there was a little bit of counseling of the perp, but it was no consequence.
Switch topics completely. We spend a lot of time on election law bills, and Representative Cassar is going to talk about one of them. A bill introduced by the Board of Elections that would allow them to stop counting most write-in votes.
Yeah, so so one of the things we take for granted is that every vote is counted, every vote counts. So this particular piece of legislation really flies in the face of that for the purpose of practicality. In this new capacity, bless you, I have come to understand that, our municipal governments have some constraints. Nobody wants new taxes, nobody wants new expenses. And there are certain places that are sort of low-hanging fruit that the municipalities feel like are easy places to cut. And very often, for some reason, that around election management really comes to be one of those spots. We have a good long way to go to make our elections a little bit more efficient. But unfortunately, the role of the municipality is just to make this happen as fast as possible at the lowest expense possible. And all of us would agree that those are probably very good goals. But with this particular piece of legislation, what municipalities were really hoping for was just to cut out all that paperwork that comes with counting the one-off. If I wrote in Edie for president, that sort of thing, which I might. But really, it's ultimately, it takes away the power of the vote. And this was one of those, there were a number of floor debates that we had that were surprising for me in that people were arguing points of view that didn't quite make sense, that didn't align with democracy or align with efficiency or effectiveness of government. And this was one that did two things. It showed how we can have a lot of good, practical, financial reasons for undermining democracy, and we have to be very, very cautious in relation to those. And the other thing it showed was, it was one of many examples of where the House and Senate are two very different bodies. And the Senate, this bill died in the Senate. It was a little, I would like to think it was a little bit of a no-brainer, but it passed in the House. And that was disconcerting, but it really showed sort of the weight of the municipality and how we feel vulnerable to anything that may cause, and I don't want to minimize it, because being a town clerk is, and a city clerk is a little bit of a thankless job, but the 8 hours of overtime or the 4 hours of overtime to get those ballots counted, and the Board of Elections as well, that just, it felt like it was an unnecessary.
Next is a trio of bills. I think what one gets out of this is the legislature mantra that animals are people too. Actually, animals are more important than people. So there were a trio of bills that we had to lobby a lot on, and Hannah's going to talk about them.
Yeah, we did have a trio of animal-themed bills that we were particularly focused on. We opposed all three of the ones that I'm going to talk about. One of them, which is, well, it is what it is. It punishes anyone who maliciously touches or teases a police horse or canine. This was signed into law. If you do either of those things, you can be stuck with either a fine or a prison sentence or both. Aside from the fact that most people who will probably be charged with this new and exciting crime that we've created this year are most likely younger individuals or people with mental health issues, it just really shows that sometimes the legislature creates unnecessary crimes that really criminalize actions that aren't necessary to be criminalized in the first place. Another bill that did pass is one that has to do with animal seizure, and this allows representatives of the RISPCA to seize animals if they appear to be aged or disabled or sick without any requirement for emergency circumstances. It's a pretty blatant violation of the constitutional guarantee against unreasonable searches and seizures. We did submit a veto request for this piece of legislation, but it was, again, signed into law, as was the previous one. But this is also just really problematic. It allows a private organization to seize property. It also, really, an animal being aged or disabled is not necessarily indicative of it being abused or needing to have extra care or needing to be tended to further. The last piece of legislation is thankfully one that did die in the Senate as well, although it did pass the House. But it would have created a new animal abuse registry that would have been maintained by the Attorney General. And what that means is that anyone who's convicted of a crime of animal abuse would have had to register with the Attorney General, and it would have been a public registry. These bills just impose really onerous requirements on individuals who are released from prison after really doing the time for these crimes already. They establish community notification requirements, which really makes it difficult for ex-offenders to reintegrate and move on with their lives. And they can also be costly, and they undermine rehabilitation for those who have to register. They also can subject people to really severe penalties if they don't follow any of the administrative requirements for the registry, which is also super problematic. And a lot of, because they're so ineffective and have a really low rate of compliance, we actually have found that a lot of animal rights groups like the ASPCA and the American Kennel Club also oppose them. So thankfully this bill did not pass the Senate. It died on the very last day of session at like 9 p.m. and we were very grateful to see that happen, but those are the circus, the legislative circus, I guess.
For the last 2 years, we've issued reports we call the State House to Prison Pipeline, and examine all the laws that the General Assembly passes every year that either create new crimes, add sentences that are already in existence, and we like to think we're making some headway, and I think we did. There weren't many new sentencing laws that passed, but the teasing one did. And you just have to shake your head, of all the important things to do in terms of considering who deserves to go to prison. How have we survived all these decades without a law like that? It can be very frustrating at times, but there it was. It passed, it's law, and as Hannah said, we're concerned about who this will actually affect, who are the people most likely to be affected by it. And that's why when we wrote a veto letter, it was joined by a number of mental health advocacy groups who were concerned about its impact, who would get arrested or charged. So it's an example of the ACLU was the only one initially raising any concerns. We were able to get others on board, but not good enough.
I think as a new legislator, it was just very striking to see sort of this disparity between the compassion with which many of my colleagues advocate on behalf of animals versus not seeing an equivalent necessarily on behalf of people or people in need or the poor. And so for me, it was I have to say it was a little bit of a struggle, but what I come away from it with is and I joked to my husband a bit about this, we're all vulnerable to cute puppies. But I think we really, it's easy to put a face on pet issues. It's much harder to put a cute face on many of there's no cute face for minimum wage. There's no cute face for pay equity. And when we think about this, it just becomes very easy. We get branded nicely, and I'm not saying my colleagues are trying to brand themselves, but anyone's going to think it's a good idea to protect, vulnerable animals. But I think we need to figure out, as we talk about some of these more complex issues, we are competing with we're competing with the cat videos. But in reality, we have to get comfortable talking about and drawing the face of what's happening when we don't pass these other more important pieces of legislation. I think we have our challenges.
Any other comments? The next one is a good bill that passed, one that we were pleased to see pass. We helped work on it, and it has to do with driver's license fines and suspensions. This is an issue that's going on all around the country. People have been looking at the problem of states that routinely suspend driver's licenses because the person has failed to pay fines or fees, sometimes not even related to driving or traffic. Rhode Island, like just about every other state, has laws allowing for suspension of driver's licenses if you haven't paid your taxes, if you're behind on your child support, just a whole bunch of irrelevant reasons. And the problem with that is if you get your driver's license taken away and suddenly you can't drive to work, it's going to be a lot harder for you to get that money to pay the fines and the fees. So it's this awful circle that people find themselves in. And to its credit, the legislature took a small step forward on that. Right now, as the law is worded, if you owe any sort of traffic fine or fee and fail to pay it on time under state law, your license is suspended. And it's suspended unless you pay the entire amount up front. So what this new law says is there has to be an ability to pay hearing before the license is suspended, and it also provides an opportunity to have the court establish a payment plan, so you don't have to pay all the money up front, even if you can afford paying some of the fine or fee. So we're very pleased to see that. We're still going to be looking at possible legal remedies for the broader issue. This is just a small part of the problem, but we're happy that this type of legislation passed. Legislators understood it. Maybe they all have fines that they have. I don't know. But we're very pleased that this was one of the good bills that passed this session. Anybody else want to say anything? The next bill was a very important one, troubling one from our perspective. Fortunately, it got neutered before the session ended. And that was a bill dealing with involuntary commitment of individuals with opioid problems. And lastly, Liana, to talk about it.
Sure. So this was a bill that provided an opportunity if a physician, medical provider felt that it was in the best interest of a patient who had an addiction issue. There could be a court hearing to involuntarily commit the person. Essentially, patients with addiction disorders would have signed documentation, if I recall correctly, that they, under certain circumstances, would agree to an involuntary commitment. And basically, this is an intervention that has been tried in other states with a certain measure of problematic results. What would happen is it really ends up being involuntary commitment is involuntary commitment. And so despite the fact that there may be some good intentions behind this, that someone who has had a substance abuse disorder agrees that should they ever fall off the wagon, please, have me committed. To some extent, that seems in theory like a good idea, but most of our behavioral health advocates indicate that this absolutely would not be in the goal, sort of aligned with goals of recovery. Anecdotally, one of the, in talking with a program in Massachusetts, what has happened is there really aren't the beds, there aren't the spaces within our behavioral health facilities. So very often people were ending up in prison facilities or ultimately incarcerated when the intention would have been for more of a health intervention. It ended up being a carceral intervention, which would have obviously poorer health outcomes, higher costs, and certainly not the intended effect of the legislation. And luckily, it did not pass as it was intended, although this was one of those bills that, for me, was educational in that it was a negotiated settlement, as I like to call the bills that get changed from what their original intent was, and it is currently a study commission to look at this. And so it takes some of the teeth out of it. It's not, from my public health background, this is not what I would have liked to have seen. I think if we're going to have a study commission on substance abuse issues, this is not exactly it, but at least it made it so that we are not going to have the involuntary.
One other piece of information I just want to throw out, and it's why I think a lot of the medical organizations vehemently opposed it, is that there's data from Massachusetts showing that individuals who are involuntarily committed in this fashion are actually more likely to die than those who are not, and that's because once they get out, they sort of have this forced withdrawal. Once they get out, it's a lot more dangerous for them to go back to take new drugs because they no longer have the tolerance. So there's this really potentially dangerous counterproductive effect. Yet there were still many legislators who really wanted to get it passed, notwithstanding this sort of evidence.
And the other piece, or another piece to add, not to seem like piling on, but I think from what I have heard from advocates around treatment for substance addicted people is that the best likelihood or best predictor of success in recovery and rehab is that the person wants it. So if you're locking someone up because they overdose, they don't necessarily want it. And then combine that with, as Liana said, we don't have enough beds in hospitals right now, even for the people who want the treatment. People are waiting as opposed to being able to show up and say, I want treatment now, I'm ready. So
Quality treatment is the solution for these individuals, not this idea.
Moving on, the next bill is another victory. It's one that was a long time coming. It was the final demise of the so-called Tampon Tax. And I asked Edith to talk about it.
It turns out there was a tampon tax simply because when our sales tax laws were enacted, tampons and pads and panty liners and all those things were not exempted from sales tax as food and clothing and other necessities were or have been exempted since we started having sales tax. Over the years, we've, in law, added a lot of things that are not to be taxed, including things on building and taking care of boats, because we've got a boat industry in Rhode Island that we want to encourage and make more affordable and more successful. And that's sort of one of my examples of if we're not taxing this stuff on boats, recreational water vehicles for on water, but we're taxing tampons and things like that. But in fact, it's, I think finally the argument got through, and it helps that we've got about a third of the legislature that's now female. But it finally got through to people that there's no comparable thing that male Rhode Islanders need as the need for menstrual supplies for women. And we've gotten to the point in time for women's liberation and women feeling comfortable being quite frank about how they want to be treated, that women are now willing to go to the State House and sit in front of TV cameras and tell members of the Finance Committee, I'm menstruating today. And you know, that's new. And so finally they found the money, which is $800,000 to eliminate the tax on menstrual supplies. It was not that these things were deliberately being taxed. It was that they hadn't been exempted. So it wasn't that the original sales tax law was anti-female. It's that people hadn't been listening, and finally they did.
Anybody else want to add?
Not in effect until October 1st. So if you need supplies right now, it would be better to go to Connecticut or Massachusetts.
Okay, moving on. Now we're going to talk about two totally unrelated to tampon bills, dealing with schools. One a bad bill that passed and a good bill that did not. I'll have Hannah talk about them.
Yes, so especially in the last few years, not just Rhode Island, but a lot of states have seen a rise in legislation that's intended to ensure protections for students when they're on campus in public schools and make sure that they're safe, but can sometimes kind of impinge on the civil liberties of students. This year, there was a bill that passed that establishes threat assessment teams on every campus in Rhode Island in public schools, and it allows school boards to adopt policies and procedures for these threat assessment teams. They're supposed to be composed of mental health professionals, guidance counselors, teachers, but they also include law enforcement. And so we had a few concerns with this legislation, but one of the biggest ones was that Rhode Island has a very well documented and very, very well spoken about, or extensively spoken about, lack of mental health personnel on school campuses. Just a few months ago, when we were at the beginning of the session, there was an issue at Kikamuit Middle School where teacher after teacher remarked that they were just missing these critical behavioral health support professionals on their campuses, and students were clearly suffering from it. I also sat in a hearing where there was a school counselor for Providence who was sitting next to me, and she told me that the current ratio for counselors to students in Providence public schools is 1 counselor for every 1,000 to 1,500 students. The recommended ratio is a lot smaller. It's 1 to 250 students. So one of our really big concerns is that because there's a lack of these really important personnel, these threat assessment teams are going to be supplemented by law enforcement officers who may not have the necessary and holistic and comprehensive training to address issues that are really just mental health or behavioral issues or normal adolescent issues instead of threatening behaviors. These threat assessment teams are really designed to identify individuals, not necessarily students, but teachers or parents or students who may potentially pose a threat to the school campus, and then evaluate them to determine whether that's a credible threat. But we're just nervous, like I said before, about how these teams could ultimately, what they could be, who they could be composed of. The other issue that we see with a lot of this type of enforcement protocol is that disproportionately students of color and students with disabilities are disproportionately affected by policies that that look for these types of behaviors, just because for a lot of students, especially students of color, students with disabilities, their behaviors that are normal are already seen as more threatening or disruptive than those of other students. So this is definitely an issue that we're going to continue following up on. This bill did pass this session, and these teams are being established. There's a policy and protocol being written right now that we've been following up with the group that is putting this together for the state, and it's something that we'll definitely be following past this year and past its inception, and making sure that these teams are not encroaching or not really damaging student civil liberties and their rights on campus. So.
One thing, she left out the punchline about Kikamuit. What had happened was there were a bunch of behavioral incidents that had occurred. It created quite a stir in the town, and so there were these school committee hearings where teachers and parents were getting up, and as Hannah said, there were a lot of them, there was a consensus really among the speakers about the importance of having mental health support in the school system that had been taken away over the years through budget cuts. What she didn't tell you was that the end result was the school committee ultimately decided what they were going to do was hire a school resource officer, a police officer, to go to the school to take care of things. So that's what we're dealing with here, and that's another reason we're concerned about how these threat assessment teams are going to play out.
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that, because that's definitely one of the most concerning aspects, is that as these really important mental health support and behavioral health personnel are disappearing from campuses, schools are supplementing that by bringing in school resource officers, and so it's a big problem. Yeah. So the other good piece of legislation that unfortunately died has to do with school computers. More and more it's becoming commonplace for public school students and other students to be issued basically loaned computers from their schools that they can take home. They can do schoolwork on them. Sometimes they're encouraged to use them for personal use. Sometimes their parents are encouraged to use them as well. It really depends on the policies of the school district. But a few years ago, we issued a really concerning report that showed that a lot of students in Rhode Island and a lot of public schools in Rhode Island, the school districts give themselves the authority to access students' computers via their camera, via their microphone, pretty much indiscriminately. And this is obviously a really massive privacy concern that's also not hypothetical. A few years ago, there was an incident in Pennsylvania where a school district secretly took more than 50,000 photos through their students' laptops and through the webcams on their school-loaned computers. So it's not an issue that we're just dreaming up and expecting to happen. It's actually been something that has been a really pressing issue in a lot of school districts across the country. And because of that, it's really important for Rhode Island to adopt a comprehensive policy for privacy for students when they're using these school-owned computers that they're expected to do schoolwork on, that they're asked to do schoolwork on, that they need to use for some of their homework and for some of their grades and their tests and classes. And this bill would have prohibited that remote access, except in very limited circumstances, and it also would have it would have limited the circumstances that school officials can search devices unless there's reasonable suspicion that misconduct had happened on that school-owned computer. So, like we said, unfortunately this bill died in committee. We'll be fighting again for it next year, but it's something that we think is a really major concern, and that is a huge privacy concern for students in Rhode Island.
Bill?
I would just say on the privacy issue, I think that going into next year, and I would like us to have sort of a broader agenda on privacy and cybersecurity. I really think that is a burgeoning issue both for the state, for kind of state systems, but individual systems, and I just don't think at this stage that our laws are really robust enough to protect, and I think this is a really important start. You know, in most of our school districts, we're looking at Chromebooks that are issued to every student. We're thinking of that as a very forward-thinking, preparing students for careers, but it also is creating a situation where they have computer and online hygiene that may not be very conducive to protecting their privacy, and I think this is going to be more and more of an issue.